Okay, so thought I would be covered the mathematics today, but given the fact that I've only got for 11 formal lectures, I want to cover the logic of money as well. As Will pointed out last week, I hadn't got there yet. Next what I'll do is I'll put a special extra lecture on in the final week, lecture 12, where I'll cover the mathematical details of unstable systems and so on for those who want to carry on in more detail. But the main thing about today is putting banks, debt and money into economics, because fundamentally it's not there. I get people like Tony Yates, who's a fairly rabid neoclassical DSGE model who claims they've had banks, debt and money in there all the time. Well, I take a look at what he calls banks, debt and money, and I'm sorry, I don't recognise it, or a bit of a satire on that later. But what we showed last week was if you simply add debt to a cyclical model of the economy, which is Goodwin's nonlinear model of cyclical growth, we got a remarkable phenomenon, this period of apparent tranquility followed by a breakdown. And since I did that presentation to you guys, I had to go on to the school students here coming in, so I redid the model, and I just happened to redo it, and I think it's worth showing you this live, but I simply turned around one of the XY plots that I can do. We can plot one variable against another rather than the variables against time. Over here I've got the debt level against the employment rate, and here I've got the wages share against employment rate. In effect, this is looking at the phenomenon side on, and this is looking at the phenomenon from top down. And watch, if you can, I think you can visually combine the two and see what's going on here. It's the same model as last week, slightly different parameter values. I've gone for an whoops, hang on, that's one of the mistakes that can happen. These buttons up here are so sensitive that sometimes when you go past you can click and drag one onto the screen. Be careful about that when you're designing models in Minsky. We've got to improve that part of the behaviour of the model. But I think I've chosen the equilibrium level of employment here. I've chosen 0.6 because I find neoclassicals find all sorts of reasons to reject something they don't like, including this model. And one argument I got was we get employment rates of above 100%, therefore that can't be sane. Well, if you look at how we define employment, it's the percentage of the working age population available for work. Okay? It's not the entire population. If you look at the employment rate against the total population, then it's about 60% to 65%, the people between the ages of 0 and 100. Okay? So I've actually just reduced this as let's work in terms of population rather than having participation rate inside this. So I made that 0.6. I've got the same reaction function as I showed you last week, so it's exactly the same basic model. Run the simulation, and what's wrong there? Okay, what have I done wrong? That bloody... hang a sec. Here we go. So notice this is looking at the phenomenon from the side on with rising debt, and this is looking down down into from above it. And I think you can clearly see that phenomenon of apparently diminishing and then rising instability. And what you've got going on here in 3 dimensions is I regard that, we're speaking about thunderstorms a short while ago, almost like a volcano or a cyclonic vortex. You're being sucked up into higher debt and chucked out the top level with a total social breakdown. So that's simply including the idea that firms borrow money to invest and have to pay interest on the debt they accumulate. And adding that to Goodwin's cyclical model, you get that phenomenon. Now, that's a linearized version. I use nonlinear functions in my paper in 1995. But that's my rendition of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. So I'm going to be actually working backwards towards Minsky now and saying that in effect what Minsky was observing in a verbal sense was that phenomenon I've just shown you in an incredibly simplified way of the impact when you bring debt into a model of the economy. So an essential part of Minsky's hypothesis was that there was a role for private debt in macroeconomics, and this is one of the most important statements he makes. Why is this important? He says the natural starting point for analysing the relation between debt and income. And I think I take a different approach to Minsky, like I did a different approach to Marx, to many who read both. But this to me was key. He's saying there's a relationship between debt and income. But of course, not only do the neoclassicals reject that, so do many post-Keynesians as well. I think we're still getting to the stage where we understand this properly. So just by simply adding in investment-oriented private debt to that Goodwin model, we got this dynamics which we actually saw in the real world. of rising apparent tranquility followed by a breakdown. Now, when I did that model the first time, it was back in 1992. I think it was about November or so of 1992. And it took 3 years for it to get published. But I ended with what I thought was a nice rhetorical flourish. So I wrote this in pretty much December 1992. And so this vision of a capitalist economy with finance requires us to go beyond the habit of mind that Keynes describes so well, the excessive reliance upon a stable recent past as a guide to the future. And it was chaotic dynamics genuinely in that model. The chaotic dynamics explored in this paper should warn us against accepting a period of relative tranquility in a capitalist economy as anything other than a lull before the storm. Well, that was a nice little rhetorical flourish. I didn't expect it to become the real world. But that's fundamentally what we saw. I showed you that last week, the period of apparent great moderation, declining cycles in employment and inflation, but of course in the background being ignored by neoclassical economists and central bankers the world over, rising private debt compared to GDP, and then a breakdown. So very, very similar behaviour. But we're still not explaining where that role comes from. In many ways, I simply assumed there was a role, and Minsky did as well. He tried to prove it in various ways, and I'm covering that in a paper for the Review of Keynesian Economics recently. But most mainstreamers, well actually almost all mainstreamers, reject any role except during liquidity trap, and some post-Keynesians say it. Now that the reasons that the mainstream say debt doesn't matter fundamentally comes down to the loanable funds model of what money is about. Money is just another market, supply and demand, equilibrium price set by the interest rate, supply of saving depending upon in their vision, depending upon the interest rate, and Keynesian so-called renditions they make dependent upon income, demand for it depending upon the interest rate as well, equilibrium point, bang, that's the end of any importance about it. And here's my favourite foil in the neoclassical world, Paul Krugman, from his book End This Depression Now, talking about the role of debt in the economy in general, rather than in a liquidity trap where he says it does have a role. To say when debt is rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. Okay? Emphatically says it's not anything to do about more money coming out of more debt. He said it's rather a case of less patient people who for whatever reason want to spend sooner than later, borrowing from more patient people. Now, one thing I find amusing about neoclassicals, they've hammered this idea that they are a value-free science. But I've never seen so many value-laden concepts turn up in a language as you get with neoclassicals. Who are the good people here? The patient people or the impatient people? Yeah? It's pejorative. The patient people are the nice ones, the impatient are the nasty ones. It's just pejorative, it's nonsense. But anyway, post-Keynesian's objection is rather more substantial because they say income is expenditure. What you spend becomes somebody else's income. There's a necessary identity between the two. And when I've been trying to reach to the stage where I give a formal explanation for the role of change in debt in aggregate demand, this is a critique of me by Brett Feiberger from the last issue of the review, I think the last issue of last year, for the Review of Keynesian Economics, which I think you can download off the website. And he said that unless I can explain how a purchase of a good does not provide income for the seller, then I've got to rethink the argument that debt extensions, I increase in debt, can force an inequality between expenditure and income at the aggregate level. And what I was doing for quite a while was saying, well, the debt comes first, then the spending. You borrow the money, then you spend it. Trying to make some sort of which comes first, chicken or the egg type argument, and then using arguments about time and discontinuity and so on. I'm going to cover that, I think, in a more... Yeah?
So when Krugman, for example, talks about debt, he's talking about overall debt and not government debt.
Exactly. He's talking about private debt.
Like government debt is always something special, that's a bad thing.
Yeah, it's always bad. Government debt's a bad thing.
Yeah, no, yeah. But
terrible stuff,
like
really. Ordering our children for the future. Yeah, sorry, pardon.
Don't you think as well that it's a specific case of debt? Like
that's... Yeah, see, they're willing to admit that the government can create money. Okay, not so much seeing it through the role of the government running a deficit, but through the central bank being able to create fiat money. And they have their vision is the helicopter money vision of the central bank can simply pour money over the country. That's where this idea that quantitative easing is printing money has come from. So they see that as a thing that has to be constrained, which is why they want the central bank not to be controlled by politicians, but be controlled by econocrats who understand economics and therefore know how the economy operates and therefore make a responsible level of increase in the supply of money, etc.
Okay, so that started in the 70s because of the inflation, right?
Yeah, it's a stagflation period, which you guys are all too young to have experienced. You're old enough to, but inflation hit as high as 17%, I think, in Australia, and I think pretty much the same in America at one point. And there's lots of reasons behind that, but the monetarist revival began at that stage with Milton Friedman arguing that inflation was always caused by the government. I've got a quote to that effect inside here, because the government prints the money. Okay? So what we have to do is control the government's money printing, and that'll stop inflation. Yeah. Pardon? Yeah. It can be done, but it's not the only way. It's not the only. What they're arguing is the only way that can happen. Okay. Yeah. And that's the point I'm making here, that there are actually two ways. In fact, if you look at the international sector as well, 3 ways you can create money. They're just saying it's only one. Okay. So what I'm going to be covering here is saying, well, in fact, no, it's two. Within a domestic economy, it's at least 2, and you're ignoring the major one. So,
like Krugman, for example, he actually deals with endogenous money, right?
Oh no, he doesn't.
No, I mean, but like he looked at it and he said, no, it's
oh yeah, it's all wrong. It's all wrong.
But still, you have to acknowledge that he's okay because he actually looks at it. Other people just ignore it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm still going to have a bit of fun trashing it, so we'll get there. Let's go. Okay. So well, I'm going to go back again to Marx's vision of money, because that's idea of the dialectic, I think, is a very important part, not just of how I think about money, but how I think you should in general, and certainly how Minsky did. And I'll just explain that in a moment after I show the basic idea. So you've got this concept of money, MCM plus circuit, okay, going from money to more money. And an essential part of that money is part of that circuit. The foreground aspect of money is that it's a commodity. It's essential for exchange in that sense. You're not going to get exchange unless you have money. But it's a non-commodity. You can't produce it by means of other commodities. So calling it a commodity is mistreating it. Okay? Which, of course, when you think about gold bugs and the barter attitude to the economy and so on, that's what they are doing, and treating money as just another commodity. So the tension between the two, in Marx's logic, comes up to saying the exchange value of money is set by its use value. Whereas normally the exchange value, the price of a product is set by its exchange value. Here, its price is set by its use value. And Marx has got some wonderful statements on that, because he's going through the whole issue. This is, I think, in Capital Volume 3. What does the industrial capitalist pay for loan capital? And he says, what the buyer of an ordinary commodity buys is its use value. What he pays is its value, its exchange value, cost of production. What the borrower of money buys is likewise its use value as capital, but what does he pay for it? And this is a wonderful little statement. Surely not its price or value, as in the case of ordinary commodities. So he then goes on a bit further and says, well, capital as capital is money rather than machinery, is a commodity, he said, all the relations here would be irrational from the standpoint of view of an ordinary commodity, one you actually can produce using other commodities. He said, if we want to call interest the price of money capital, then it's an irrational form of price. So he's saying it's not your ordinary commodity. And finally he says, how can a sum of value have a price beside its own price? He said, price is the value as distinct from its use value. This is that exchange value, use value conflict. A price which differs in value and quality is an absurd contradiction. But then he says, it doesn't depend on the value as money or as commodities, but the quantity of surplus value they produce for the owner. The reason you want the money is to produce more money. This is the MCM plus argument. And he finally says, what is sold is its use value. And its function in this case is producing exchange value to yield profit. Okay. So the reason you want the money is because it's a way of you accessing the capability of making a profit. That's why you want to borrow the money. And that's the perspective that Minsky had in his own thinking about the monetary system. And a little anecdote about that involves his son Alan, whom I met when I was writing the first edition of Debunking Economics back at the Levy Institute back in 2000. And that's where Levy Institute was one of the places that Minsky was finally working in his final few years before he died. And Alan said to me that he had a usual sort of father-son conflict, got involved in the independent media, didn't really want to know what Dad was doing, and then by the time he hit his 30s, got over that conflict, got interested in his father's work and approached him one day and said, what book would you recommend for me to start reading about economics? Because he hadn't looked at anything at all at this stage. He said, Dad went into his study, came out, and handed it looked like this. He said, this is the first one to read. Das Kapital, Volume 1. Now, you won't find a single reference to Marx in Minsky's writings. The reason was he wrote during the McCarthyist period. And if you even acknowledged that you'd looked at the cover of a copy of Das Kapital, that was enough to get you kicked out of a job in a university. It was that extreme. That's why I've linked down here to you don't know about the McCarthyist period. Has anybody never heard of it before? If you've not heard of McCarthy, Joe McCarthy, you haven't heard? Okay. He was an American senator who became famous and then ultimately notorious for waving a list saying, I have a list here of known Communist Party sympathisers in the State Department, saying 136 people who are known members of the Communist Party. A real witch hunt was begun against anybody who might have affiliations with the Communist Party in America. They formed what was called the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And one of the opening questions was, are you or have you ever been or have you known anybody who is a member or a supporter of the Communist Party? If you answer the question yes, you're most likely going to get sacked from whatever government job you might have. So most people take the Fifth Amendment on that front and plead they wouldn't say something that's going to incriminate themselves, which it themselves incriminated themselves. Awful period in American history. It turned out Joe McCarthy was a fraud. That list didn't exist. He didn't have any names. He had no evidence. But it gave you about a 10-year period in America where any acknowledgement of any reading of Marx or anything left-wing whatsoever ended up losing your position. So you won't find a single reference to Marx in Minsky's writing, but fundamentally his logic comes from that background. His parents were members of the Communist Party. They met at a Communist Party function in Chicago. I think there was a copy of Das Kapital. Pardon? You speak up, my hearing's really clear. In the Menshevik movement? Yeah, not the Bolshevik. Yeah, which is another. Yeah. So again, they were non-conventional in their approach to Marx as well, which I think is a good thing. So, okay, but that's the background to Minsky, which I'll cover a bit in the final lecture. Apart from the extra one I'm going to give on mathematics in the week after lectures finish, but that's also a background to the circuit theory, which developed out of Europe. So a lot of the work you'll find in circuit theorists has a neoclassical flavour to it initially. A lot of stuff that Graziani does. But again, it's informed by having a appreciation of Marx and this non-orthodox understanding of money. And what's called the circuits theory began in France and Italy, and it's related to the post-Keynesian approach to economics, and they have what they call the monetary theory of production. And the leading character there is a guy called Graziani, who only died last year. Wonderful, elegant, both writer and thinker and person. He was an amazing individual. Only stood about 5 foot tall, but standing on a stage, it looked like he was about 10 foot tall. He had this wonderful posture. And he's the only person I've known who can speak in entirely perfectly formed English paragraphs. You ask him a question, you got a paragraph, perfectly formed. Brilliant orator, wonderful speaker. But his position on working out the role of money and how do you get a monetary theory, you've got to say what money is. And he basically posed this question: how does a monetary economy differ from a barter economy? And he said the first principle is that money can't be a commodity. And it's quite simple logic, because if you say money is a commodity, then you've got a barter system. So he said a true monetary economy is inconsistent with the presence of commodity money, because commodity money is, by definition, a kind of money that any producer can produce for themselves. It's like if you think about New Guinea, the ideas about New Guinea tribes using conch shells, well, you can just go find some conch shells on the beach. Gold's a bit more complicated, but if you're willing to go and spend a bit of time in the gold fields, you might find some gold. You certainly would have found more gold 5,000 years ago than you'll find now. So that sort of stuff, you can produce it. If you don't have it, you can go produce it. Has anybody seen the recent American movie A Million Ways to Die in the West? Hilarious movie, highly recommended. It starts off with a gold prospector being shot. That's not giving away much, but it's a very, very funny movie. And they're in the countryside mining gold, because if gold was money, you could produce it yourself by mining. But he says, well, that is, you really can't, you can't distinguish an economy using a commodity as money from barter. All you're saying is we're using this particular commodity as intermediary. Okay? It's a slight elaboration of a barter system, but fundamentally a barter system is not a monetary system. So he said to have a truly monetary economy, you've got to be using a token money, which is nowadays a paper currency. Now, if you see that, you might think immediately notes. Okay? It's not just notes. A cheque, which we used to write to pay money to, is also paper. Okay? Anybody ever had a cheque account? Yep. Okay, the older ones in the room have had them. Okay? You write a piece on a piece of paper, you sign it, give it to somebody, and they give you goods back. That's still paper. Okay? So it isn't just notes that are paper here, it's various forms of cheques, etc., etc. So a true monetary economy has to be using a token. The piece of paper itself is worthless. You can't do anything with it. Okay? You can barely even write on it. So it's not something which is useful in its own right. Yeah?
But I mean, also gold is already a token, because not everybody has a gold melting machine at home and can melt it into something useful. So
but
it's already, you know what I mean?
This is one of the arguments that coins themselves are also fundamentally a form of credit money, because they're often stamped to be authorised and so on. Okay, because we don't go around weighing the stuff, working out what you didn't go shop. Even with gold, people didn't go shopping by taking a few lumps of gold and weighing it on a till and then or level and working out how much they needed to pay. So yes, there's a strong argument, and Graeber makes this argument in Debt the First 5,000 Years, that even coin-based systems were normally not commodity, even though they had like copper inside of a certain worth, or gold in some cases, and silver. They were still stamped with authority. One of his arguments for this is that the Roman coins were being used about 1,000 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire, not because of their gold content, but because they were just used they were accepted as payment of taxes in each of the countries in which you lived, and they were a recognised accounting system. So they're still fundamentally seen as credit. So, but the basic idea is here that you have a token of some description, something which is not you can't make it yourself as a commodity, and it doesn't have any use itself as a commodity. Okay? So it's a token. And you think about it, when people are arguing in favour of gold now and saying we should use gold as money, they're not really saying gold as money. What they're saying is we don't like monetary system, we want to go back to barter, believing we had barter in the first place. Okay. So they want to they want to go to a system of barter, which they think will control all the bad things a monetary system does. So they're not really saying money is gold or gold is money. Second principle from Graziani, money is not credit. That sounds a bit strange when you first see it, but he said in a credit economy, at the end of the period, some agents still owe money to others. A final payment is needed. So you can give somebody a promissory note saying, here's a promissory note worth $100. In return for this note, will you give me $100 worth of goods? And the firm who you're buying off might say, I'll give you $98 worth of goods. Okay. And a short time later, you've got to give us the other $2. Or if you want $100 worth, you've got to give us $2 more later. It's a credit. You've still got a debt obligation between you and the person you bought things from. So with a credit, you buy something on credit, you walk out the door with whatever you've bought on credit, but you have an obligation to the person who's the seller still. Have you ever been to a corner shop and they know you and you forgot to bring your wallet, and they say, oh, don't worry, you can take the milk, pay us later? Okay? You've got the goods, but you've got a credit relationship between you and the shop. So that's not money either. So he said, the third principle is that you can't exploit seigniorage. If you have a token and you have the right to produce the token, you can't just continue producing the tokens, forever delaying final payment. Okay? So you can't use a promise as payment. You can't use your own promise as payment. So Graziani's insight here, I think, is a brilliant insight. It's not a commodity. It's not a mere promise to pay. It's got to be something else. And he said the only way to combine these three elements together, these are the three basic conditions you have to meet. The first is it has to be a token, otherwise you've got barter. The second is it has to be accepted as a means of final payment, otherwise you're talking credit. And the third, it can't give the producer of that promise, the which we know it has to be, or the token, the producer of the token can't get unlimited rights of seigniorage to make money out of it. So he says the only way to satisfy these three conditions is to have payment made by means of promises of a third agent. The typical third agent being nowadays a bank.
Isn't C violated by banks creating money?
Not if they're, it could be, and it's equally by the government as well, if they use that capacity to just go and buy goods straight away. So there's an argument if they do that.
Couldn't a loan be considered a good?
No. The loans are different. But if the bank itself was purchasing stuff using its own capacity to create money, we'll talk about that later, but that's more of a complication. But in general, he's talking about an idealised situation here. Okay? If you had a perfectly well-behaved bank, which I know is an oxymoron. Okay?
There's one currency that does meet all three.
Pardon?
There is one currency today that does meet all three of those conditions.
Bitcoin?
Bitcoin.
Yeah,
so
yeah. So, but Bitcoin's also got this crazy idea about being limited in supply, etc., and
No,
yeah.
I mean the mining gets harder and harder for the Bitcoin.
Oh, I know. That's the
mathematically,
yeah.
you've got to throw more at it. But the point is that they don't actually create it either. It's the algorithm.
The algorithm,
And
that's
the
true.
algorithm
Yeah,
is created,
yeah.
not them. So
I think
there isn't actually any agent that
Yeah.
can exploit any seigniorage.
yeah. But it then comes down how much then the question is, what do you regard a Bitcoin as being worth? The promise becomes rather more elastic, which is the problem we're having right now. It's gone from what a maximum, it went from cents to $1,200 down to what, 300 now?
It's another oxymoron because you're valuing it back against dollars or a fiat currency.
That's the
So
trouble.
You shouldn't actually do that. You should look at it against the price of goods and services that it purchases. It meets those three conditions. As soon as you compare it back to a fiat currency, you're going to have the same problem.
But the trouble is, I mean, I could have bought, like 1 year ago, I could have bought my Brompton bicycle with 2 Bitcoin. Now it'd take 8 to buy the bicycle. It's the instability, I think, it's more of an issue with. But we'll get to Bitcoin.
That's
yeah.
to do with the number in circulation because you get the dilution effect.
Well, I think it's also in terms of bubbles, which we're injecting the Bitcoin into a monetary system where there are bubbles, and it's became a bubble, and classic bubble and crash afterwards. But again, maybe talk about it more in the tutorial on that one. But here we have the idea, he said when an agent makes payment by means of a cheque, and notice he's saying a cheque here, not a note, not a bank note, he satisfies his partner by promise of the bank to pay the amount due. So once the payment is made, no debt and credit relationships are left between the two agents, buyer and seller, but one is now a creditor of the bank and the other is a debtor of the same bank. Okay? So I think it's a beautiful resolution of what's involved in having a monetary economy, and that insight is what enabled me to start building my Minsky software package and start thinking in these monetary terms, because before I saw this argument, I couldn't really work out how to bring money effectively into the systems. That's an incredibly brilliant insight. And what he added to it as well is saying, for this to be true, any monetary payment must therefore be a triangular transaction involving at least 3 agents: the payer, the payee, and the bank. And the standard vision, when you think about how we're being conditioned to think about an economy, courtesy of neoclassical economics, is 2 people trading 2 goods and trying to work out a relative price. Okay, so you've got one person who wants to sell cameras to another person who wants to sell apples, and they've got to work out some exchange rate between the two. Okay? And that's the whole issue, is working out 2 goods, 2 commodities, relative price is what matters. But what Graziani is saying is a monetary system is 3-sided. You have a single commodity and a financial exchange. So you have person A giving person B delta units of commodity X in return for person B telling bank Z to transfer, I think that's theta, isn't it? I keep losing my Greek characters, units of currency from B's bank account to A's bank account. So this is what I call capitalism's eternal triangle. You have, here's A again, still trying to flog the camera. There's B, who wants to buy the camera and tells the bank, okay, transfer theta dollars of my account across to A's. And that's where the transaction comes from. So it's a triangular vision of capitalism, and it works beautifully. It just keeps on going from that level up. So you've got all exchanges being 3-sided, and you can't lump firms and banks together, which again is the sort of stuff the neoclassicals do. Again, post-Keynesians in general, total separation of the two, which is the right way to treat it. So the reason you can't lump them together is they have fundamentally different roles in capitalism. Firms produce commodities, banks produce money. They're not the same thing by any stretch of imagination. So here's Graziani again. Banks and firms must be considered as two distinct kinds of agents. Firms are present as buyers and sellers of commodities, and they make recourse to banks to perform their payments. Banks, notice this, on the other hand, produce means of payment and act as clearinghouses among firms. Okay? Produce means of payment. And this is the whole idea of producing money and thereby producing demand. So he said, in any model of monetary economy, banks and firms cannot be aggregated into one single sector. So again, I really recommend reading that paper. A lot of things I find wrong with the paper when he tries to go from the initial logic to doing mathematical versions of it. Ignore the mathematics, it's all static stuff and it's all wrong. But the insights in the beginning of the paper are brilliant. I'll back those up on the website. I'm sorry I haven't got anything added for today's lecture yet, but I only finished it at 15 minutes before the hour, so a fair bit of work went into this one. So that vision inspired how I developed Minsky. What I showed you last week were just the system dynamics aspect of it, and they're not original. You can find those in a whole lot of programs, Simulink being the dominant one in engineering, Venseeing being the dominant one in social modelling. But the unique aspect is using double-entry bookkeeping to create those monetary equations. So let's look at the role of banks as Graziani goes through them. The first one he says is banks produce means of payment. The second is act as clearinghouses amongst firms. Now, the second role is the one that neoclassicals are willing to acknowledge, if they acknowledge them at all. But you need double-entry bookkeeping for both of those roles. So let's take a look at the way it happens with the second role first of all. So here we have, you want to buy goods, you have firm A, which is a buyer, and firm B, which is a seller. Buying goods involves a transfer of money from firm A's account to firm B's account. Anything look peculiar there?
Everything's on the liability side.
Important point. Everything's on the liability side. Notice the transfer I've got going on there. There's the buyer. I've got plus 100 in the buyer's account. It's positive because it's reducing the bank's liability. Okay, you're looking at it from the bank's point of view now. And I could do this as debit and credit. Has anybody here done accounting? Okay, a few of you have. So I could use debit and credit there. What I'm using instead is plus and minus. And the logic in Minsky is that flows are always from plus to minus. So the plus is the originating place, the minus is the destination. And then liabilities and equity are both shown as negatives, so that each row sums to zero. So if I had, and you'll see this in a moment, when I look at the creation of money roll, I've got exactly the same sign, okay? Plus and minus turning up. But if you think from the bank's point of view, if firm A has $10,000 and that's deposit account, that's a liability to the bank, which in the bank's point of view is minus 10,000. Now, if the buyer pays $100 across to firm B, then the bank's liability to firm A falls from minus 10,000 to minus 9,900. So showing it as a plus there makes sense. It's hard to get used to, but once you do it, it's really easy. I, in fact, find this, anybody doing accounting, I speak to the YouTube audience as well, use Minsky to work out any problem and then press the button showing show me debit and credits. It'll give you the right answers. So we've set up a complete translation between, I'll show you that later in a moment. But so that's why you've got plus on the buyer, from the buyer to minus on the seller. There's been an increase in the firm's accounts, which increases the liability the bank owes to the firm. So that's negative there for that reason. That's the basic logic, and I'll use that throughout now. And it's triangular, just as Graziani argues, because when you look at it this way, you have there's the buyer telling the bank to make a transfer of money to the seller, in return for which the goods are then exchanged. So that's the triangular nature there. Now, you need reserves from multiple banks, not because reserves are needed to create money. That's one of the neoclassical myths, coming from not understanding accounting amongst many other things. But if you have a situation where firm A banks at bank 1, firm B banks at bank 2, then what's actually going on initially is the money has to be taken out of bank 1. Okay? So the reserves of bank 1 will fall, and that's again another reason why I've got plus over here, because if you actually took the money out as a cheque, you're writing a cheque which reduces the reserves. Well, actually take it out as cash is more easy to understand. The reserves fall by 100. Then, that's the plus there. That then comes down here to credit the seller, so I've still got the same relationship plus and minus there. But the drop in reserves for Bank 1 become a rise in reserves for Bank 2. And of course that's all done at the central bank. So the same relationship applies here. There's plus 100 for Bank 1, minus 100 for Bank 2 because the liability of the central bank to Bank 2 has risen, and that's the relationship between the two. Okay? Yeah?
And the central bank doesn't need any assets because it's the central bank.
It's because of the central bank. That's right. The central bank has unlimited capability to create the currency, so I can just say...
Everybody, or the whole system is on the asset side of the central bank.
Pardon?
The whole system is on the asset side of the central bank.
Effectively, yeah. The whole economy. So that's the basic logic there, and you get that same triangular relationship. There's Bank 1 to Bank 2 through the central bank. So that triangular vision is a really powerful way of setting up your vision of the entire economy. Now that explains the accounting significance of banks, but it does nothing to explain their macroeconomic significance. Okay? Because the clearinghouse just is a way of facilitating trade. It's not actually creating any additional demand. So the reason banks matter is that first role that Graziani mentions. Banks produce means of payment. And that's missed completely by the neoclassical vision of loanable funds. And here we go again, back to the quote from Krugman. It's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. It's just a case of less patient people giving to more patient people giving to less patient people. So what they see going on, that's lending. Okay? So patient reduces their account at the bank, impatient increases it. It's just redistributing bank liabilities. Nothing is happening on the asset side. Okay? Now, the real world is exactly what Graziani said. Banks produce the means of payment because bank lending creates new assets as well as new liabilities at the same time. So if you see what's going on with the bank, that's what's happening. Plus 100 on the asset side, minus 100 on the liability side, balanced overall, always balanced. Okay? But there's been an increase in assets and an increase in money, and this is why I'm going outside the accepted bounds of post-Keynesian economics right now, also an increase in demand. And the best way to think about that is if you go shopping with a credit card. Because a credit card we see as one operation, but if you want to put it together, and this is why I had the timing argument when I was first trying to explain how I saw change into having a role in aggregate demand. When you access your credit card for $100 to say you're buying an MP3 player at some shop, then your debt to the bank goes up by 100, and then you transfer that to the shop. Okay? It's a two-step operation. So technically speaking, that one does become before that one. Because if you try to access this and you haven't got the credit, then that line can't happen. Okay? So one does cause the other. But two things have people arguing that change in debt has no macroeconomic impact. One is loanable funds, which ignores the fact that banks lend money, or argues it doesn't make any difference, which is total, to quote myself from a newspaper article once, total bullshit. That was not something I expected the journalist to publish, by the way. But it's total bullshit to ignore the role of banks in creating money. And the endogenous money implies a huge impact, but they then argue, well, expenditure equals income, so how does change in debt turn up? So I've got to go through a two-stage process of explaining all this to you, and what I'm going to do initially is use Minsky to show how you can go from loanable funds to endogenous money. Who's got a copy? Who's got the Minsky on their computer? Have you got a copy with you? Get it running. For those, did you get your working, or you did? Great, excellent. So just if you get it up, you can actually click along with me if you like. But the main reason that Minsky matters as a software package is that innovation of using Godley tables. Genuinely named and honoured Wynne Godley, by the way. I think Wynne Godley, again, if Wynne Godley hadn't shown me his tabular approach, I doubt I would have worked it out either. It's a combination of Graziani's insight with the idea of showing things using accounting. And it took me a while to learn the importance of Doubleentry as well. I didn't have that initial versions of Minsky or the way I approach this. Well, let's consider a really simple system. And I'm going to, and the bank accounts in this model, I'm going to have in capital letters, and the flows I'm going to have in a capitalised lowercase. An absolutely, totally simplest possible monetary system with a constant stock of money. So I'm not looking at any change in the amount of money. So I've got loans as a system state, but there's nothing happening with loans. I've got a firm sector that hires workers using wages. Firms then pay interest to the bank. Workers and bankers both consume, and I've got cons underscore W and B to show their consumption. And so it's just 4 accounts. You have loans, firm, workers and bankers. And you have 4 flows. You have wages, interest, and the 2 forms of consumption. So you really can't get much simpler than that. Okay. Now you could build that using the flowchart approach I showed you last week. And what it would look like is this. So, do you all understand that? Now, this part over here is defining the terms, but the banking bit is that bit there. And take a look at it. I've got nothing happening with loans. Okay. I've got the rate of change of firms being consumption by workers plus bankers minus interest payments. Have I misdefined that? I didn't mean to, but I think I did. Yeah, I haven't got wages being taken out of there. I've made a mistake. Okay, unintentional mistake. I've made a deliberate mistake later. Workers getting wages in and consuming out, and banks getting interest in and consumption going out as well. So let's bring that model up here. Have I? Oh no, there we've got wages coming over from over here. Yeah, there's the wages over there. So again, I've made my own point. It's pretty hard to read, isn't it? Okay. So that's it as a flow chart. This is it as double entry bookkeeping. So there's the same definitions that you saw beforehand is still there, but the banking system is over here, and that's what you've got. So you have hire workers, wages flowing from the firms to the workers, interest payments to the banks, consumption by workers, consumption by bankers. Follow that? It's just easy to understand using double entry bookkeeping. So that's one advantage of doing it using Minsky.
What are you implying that bankers consume, sorry?
Oh, because they've got to buy goods.
Ah.
Okay. I mean, in this sense, I could break it. What I've got is it's so simple that I'm ignoring the fact that there are capitalists who earn dividends from firms, etc., etc. Absolutely basic. So I'm aggregating firms and capitalists. I'm aggregating bankers, and they're buying of Lamborghinis, and they're buying of auto teller machines, etc., etc. Okay.
They're technically workers under that.
And workers as well. Yeah. If I added that, I'd have a much more complicated system. And you can do it. They're saying it's the absolutely simplest possible way of rendering it is just as I've done there. That's all. Not that I argue that's reality. Now, it's easy to spot mistakes in the system as well. So I've made a deliberate mistake in this model. And you can see what's happening with incomes and bank accounts. They're rising like crazy. Can you see the mistake?
Who is green?
Pardon? Green is the bank. But they're all rising. Bank accounts are all rising.
Bank has no income.
Pardon?
The bank has no income.
No, bank's got plenty of income. Can't see it? In about an hour or so you might spot it. I've got a plus sign there, or there should be a minus. There's nothing to stop me doing that in defining these systems. Now if I make the same mistake in double entry bookkeeping, this is what happens. It shows the rows doesn't sum to 0. So even before I try simulating the model, it tells me I've made an error. Okay? If I simulate it, then I see the error turning up. But it's a simple case of saying I've got to just go through and make that shouldn't be a minus over here, that should be a plus. Pardon me. Should be that should be a plus over there. So I get confused with my own convention. It's also easy to extend the model. So let's say we actually want to take some more of that realism here. So I'm going to have capitalists to receive dividends, and a new sector, mining, which buys inputs from firms, and I could add workers employed by the bank and all that other stuff. Well, I can simply whack extra columns in there. And if you look here, I've now got mines and I've got capitalists. I've now got capitalists being paid dividends by the firm, capitalists consuming. I've got the firm buying materials off the firm, the mines buying materials off the firms, or rather selling materials, buying machines, paying wages. On you go. You just expand it. Now, of course, what happens is your table grows, but you can keep track of multiple tables as well, and that's one of the neat features here. So here I've got at the moment, I've got just the vision from the point of view of the bank. I've added an extra godly table there. When you open that godly table up, what it shows you is this range of bits and pieces here. So we're going to improve. This is an old... If I had extra money to fund it, what I'd do is I'd instantly have a table coming up showing assets, liabilities and equity, separately divided, and you just type inside whichever one you wanted to add a variable to. But here you've got to click on this button called No Asset Class. And what that does is give you a drop-down. So it shows you three choices: asset, liability and equity. If you choose firms as the asset, that when you choose on an asset and hit that drop down, those three, what are currently liabilities elsewhere in the system, and equity, banks equity, firms as a liability of the bank, workers as a liability of the bank, they pop up. Choose firms there, and Minsky instantly populates the table with all the operations that are currently shown. And notice your row sum is not 0. Okay. Well, that's because you need an extra row for loan, extra column for loans. So I'll do that. Having done loans, I've now got loans inside there, but I've still got all these operations that haven't been balanced. So you've got to include the equity of the firm sector. And now when I put a minus in here for consumption by banks and for consumption by workers, and a plus for interest and wages, all the rows sum to 0, and I've now got a complete system. Okay? And you can add the government that way. You can add a central bank. You could add, if you wanted to, it'd be difficult right now, but you could add another country and then show the flows between them. So that's the reason that Minsky has been invented. And you define the flows the same way you do inside the flowchart model. I'll show you that in a moment. So what I've done now, there's the bank icon. So I go and click on wages, and I right click on that block, and I get a drop down menu. Get a drop down menu with edit and copy. Now don't choose edit. Edit's going to have to go. That's just one of those things we had for a while we're going to have to get rid of. So you choose copy, and you then get a copy of that icon you can drag over and place it somewhere by left clicking somewhere on the screen. Then I'm going to do the same thing down here for firms. So I want to grab the firms as a stock variable. So click on that, right click, choose copy, drag it over here, place it somewhere. And then I now want to define a rate of flow between the firms and wages. So the stocks, basically you're going to be doing operations on stocks to give you flows. And I explain this later on in the lecture. I'm using what's called a time constant. Now, if you imagine you've got $100 in the firm's account, and it's every year it's paying $400 to workers, okay, per year, then its rate of flow is 4 times a year, or every 3 months, which is 1/4 of a year. Okay? So if I divide that 100 by 1/4, I'm then saying the flow of wages is $400 per year. Follow or not? Okay. So I just put a time constant in here. I'm going to call this tau W. So backslash and TAU creates the word tau. There's tau W. Divide by block. Wire them up. You can notice it's a pain sometimes grabbing hold of that icon there. Make that a value of 0.25, which means they pay out every 3 months. You're going from M to M plus in that sense. And what the program then generates, those are the equations I've already created by creating the Godley table. That's the equation I've just defined, saying wages are equal to the balance of the firm's account divided by the time constant for the payment of wages. Okay? So that's the basic logic of doing a Minsky model like that. So that flow fragment there is defining that set of equations. And you can go between the two and just check and see what your logic looks like as you go through building a model. Now, it's pretty much time to take a little 10-minute break. So let's do that, and I'll come back and I'll go through and show you how to build loanable funds using this approach. Okay? Back in 10 minutes.